Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. This webinar is How to Build a Scalable Customer Analytics Hub. I'm Caroline Wright, and I'm coming to you from Tampa here at CONVERGENCE Consulting Group. I'm just going to do a quick introduction of our speakers and then hand it off for some content. A few housekeeping things before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording and the slides will be made available to everyone on this webinar and everyone who's who is registered at the end of the recording. You all will be in listen-only mode for this presentation, but if you have any questions or issues during the presentation, please submit those using the question box to the right of your screen. We will be saving some time for Q&A at the end, so please also submit questions regarding the content throughout. We'll be sure to get to as many of those questions as possible. If there are any questions we don't get to at the end, we will follow up with an email to answer those. A little bit about who we are, so you guys know who is sending you the content today. We're CONVERGENCE Consulting Group. We're again coming to you live from Tampa, and we are data and analytics consultants. We help businesses to transform data assets into actionable intelligence to overcome challenges and gain a competitive advantage. Your speakers today are both from CONVERGENCE Consulting Group. John Bastone heads up customer analytics for CCG. Previously with SAS and Catalina Marketing, he has experience helping all kinds of B2C organizations to better understand and connect with their customers. His primary experience has been in retail. Lexy, also with CONVERGENCE Consulting Group, is a data scientist and analytics architect here. She's worked in analytics consulting for over 15 years and is considered an expert in all things marketing analytics. She's even an avid blogger if you want to follow her at lexykassan.com. Lexy and John are both on the Business Solutions Group here at CCG and work to develop customer analytics solutions to help organizations get, grow, and keep their customers. At this time, I'm going to now hand it over to John to share with you a little bit more about what you'll be hearing today and go through the content.
Hey guys, thanks for joining. Again, this is John Bastone. So pleased to have you on this webinar. And for those of you who have stayed throughout the webinar series, really appreciate it. Just as a brief setup, I thought I'd go into where we are in the journey across the 3 steps of customer analytics maturity. So I'll give a brief recap around the webinar series, as well as what Lexy will be focusing in on today. And then at that point, she'll be going into quite a bit of detail around some of the strategies and tactics in scaling analytics. And I'll go ahead and do a wrap up around our stair-step methodology for how you can chunk this up and eventually evolve your capabilities, and we'll go into Q&A. Ideally, we'll be to the Q&A at about 45 after, if everything goes according to schedule. So as a brief recap of where we're at, this entire webinar series is in and around really all things customer analytics. We started with a webinar around driving customer loyalty with Azure Machine Learning. That video is now available on demand at the link below. From there, and that topic of that webinar ultimately went into a lot of Azure Machine Learning and honed in on a specific churn use case. From there, we went into the second webinar, which is also on demand, around operationalizing customer analytics with Azure and Power BI. So this was going ahead and taking a churn model and how do you go ahead and visualize it and deploy it in the hands of a business decision maker that can actually do something with the analysis. And the last one is ultimately building a scalable customer analytics hub. So we've had a pretty pointed use case around churn within the context of a marketing organization, but how do we extend advanced analytics capabilities in a way that is more relevant to the entire enterprise, and that also takes into account the increasing reality of all different types of data, structured, unstructured, semi-structured, that has to be contended with and ideally is mined and benefited from around these types of exercises, and that's the focus of today. So, as it relates to today's webinar, Lexy will be going into building a scalable customer analytics hub, and specifically she'll be setting it up around how it is critical that any analytics endeavor that you have, but particularly around customer analytics, is ultimately built with eyes towards scaling for the enterprise. She'll go into some of the data considerations around not only increasing data volumes, but also the increasing breadth of data sources that many organizations have to contend with. And we'll get into some of the practical applications and ways to solve issues that are related to the volume, variety, and velocity of that data, ultimately driving towards some of the increased analytical capabilities that companies can take advantage of right now in the Microsoft Azure stack. And with that, I will hand it off to my partner in crime, Lexy Kassan. Take it away, Lexy.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that. Before we get too deep into the content, we're going to put a poll up. So this poll will become more clear in the next slide. So your options here, the question is, which of these is your current biggest challenge in scaling customer analytics? We'll give you a little bit to respond. Your options here are analytics tools, source processing, integration, data integrity, or analytics silos. So each of these speak to a different challenge in scaling analytics across the enterprise. I'll give just a couple of seconds here for folks to respond. All right. So our responses look like, wow, very, very opposite ends of the spectrum. So we've got 25% saying analytics tools. The tools that our analysts and data scientists are using are insufficient to the task, or analytics silos, insights and analytics developed are used in small parts of the organization. Okay. Interesting. So there are a number of aspects of this that we'll cover in today's webinar in talking about scaling in various ways. So let's get started. All right, so when we talk about scaling analytics, there are kind of two areas that this falls into: scaling up and scaling out. In big data, we talk about the 5 V's of big data, and I've aligned in this case the scaling of analytics to the same 5 V's. So in scaling up, we have a larger volume of existing data, so increasing the amount of information coming in from sources you already have. We've got an extended variety of sources, so John spoke to this a little bit in what types of information are you bringing into your systems and then using. A higher velocity of ingestion, so moving towards real-time and stream processing. Those are all parts of a scale up. On the scaling out side, you can pull all of this information together, but you still have to ensure veracity of the information provided. That means governing it. That means ensuring that other areas of the organization trust the data that you're putting together and eventually the analyses that you're putting together, which also brings value to those other areas. So while we may have started this as a churn model coming out of the marketing group, there are other areas that benefit from that. And so that's really a scale out approach. So let's talk about where we start. Typically, when you have, in your organization, you'll typically start with a structured data set in your data ecosystem, but that's going to change over time. You may have data warehouses or databases that are part of your structured data environment. Could be ODS. These typically come from constituent data environments from various parts of the organization and may or may not be stitched together. But then there's semi-structured data coming from other sources, things like web tracking or product attributes, connections between similar entities in a graph style. All of those end up being in a separate environment. They can't be modeled readily into a structured environment, or it requires a heavy lift. Then there's all the unstructured data, so things like emails or documents, images, videos, audio files, all of which provide valuable content that could be mined, but require additional sources and additional storage. And then as we move towards real time, increasing that velocity towards streaming data, where you might have IoT or sensor information, social media, weather, traffic, stock quotes, all kinds of different real-time information that could be fed into applications. It starts to increase that velocity, and now we have point solutions for all of these things. But there is another option, which is to scale using something that can actually pull all of those together. And so that little icon down at the bottom is Azure Data Lake Storage, which can actually pull all of these things together so you can analyze them in one place. Now that data lake allows for a multitude of data sources and data types to be pulled together in a no schema required method. So we talk about it as being schema on read, so you don't have the same typical ETL lift that would otherwise make a process like integrating your data in this manner much more arduous. There are also tools that sit on top of Azure Data Lake Storage, such as Data Lake Analytics and Azure Machine Learning, that allow it to be used in your modeling and data science much more readily. You can also use HD Insights, which brings in Hadoop and Spark, as well as other technologies, to do stream processing against what's stored. And it's not to say that it has to sit in your data lake. So obviously there are some technologies that are easier to use or that are more readily used, like SQL or more structured environments. Once everything is stored in your data lake, it becomes a component to be read into a data warehouse. So it's in talking about the Azure SQL Data Warehouse, that enables you to bring in data from that data lake, from all of those unstructured, semi-structured stream processing sources, and leverage them against other structured data, such as SQL databases or other environments. You can have them in Azure or not. All of those are then pulled together into a data warehouse if you want it to be structured, and those can then be served up to applications like Power BI for business intelligence, or into machine learning applications much more readily, so that you're not dealing with the same schema on read as you move up the stack. The nice part about Azure SQL Data Warehouse is that it's immediately massively parallel processing, which gives you the same scalability and parallelization for the volume processing that you would otherwise get with a massively parallel processing appliance without the enormous overhead. So you don't have to buy a multi-million-dollar box to get those same benefits. Let's talk a little bit then about scaling up our churn model. How does this apply? Well, in our churn model, what you can see here is the actual weightings. So this is a feature of using Azure Machine Learning. You can go in and see your model, how it's been trained. In our actual weightings, we have a number of different features that could be leveraged on a larger scale, so scaled up. First of all, we used an extract. In the first webinar, we had an extract of several thousand records, and we used a small set of data features. In this case, we're going to talk about how we can scale those up, and there are a few in here that we'll kind of call out. We have contract data, we have charge information, we have technical support, and of course we have the size of that file. So if we think about the original scale, we had an extract, which we would move towards being the full database. We would score the entire customer file. We had contract type in there a couple of times, one for a 2-year contract, one for a month-to-month. What we would look for there is a velocity change, so that if someone changed their contract, it would trigger an update to their score. So we can immediately reflect that information. We also had total charges. So think about what would happen if you're able to identify abnormal charges above a contract. This was for telecommunications, so that might mean something like going over usage or having international calls in a given month. This would enable you to update the score to reflect those changes and to potentially trigger some business processes around that. We'll talk about that in just a moment. We also had technical support usage, which was a binary. However, if we were pulling in IoT data, such as sensors, we could actually flag outages in real time to anticipate the need for technical support, which gives not only a velocity increase towards real time, but also volume as we're pulling in more and more of this IoT data. There are also types of information that had been missing from our churn model, simply was not there. There was no sentiment data. There was no information about how a customer service call had gone or a technical support service had gone. So imagine, if you will, if you had social media mentions and sentiment. This could all be fed from both internal systems like a live chat or a customer service application that's reading and interpreting the information coming from those calls, converting audio into text and sentiment, or from social media that's being pulled in from third party. That could all provide additional scale for your telco churn model. Let's move then to scaling out. We started with this analysis as part of the marketing area, but it has applications across multiple other areas of the organization. So scaling out really means leveraging those insights, analytics, and models elsewhere in the organization. For example, how does your churn model impact hiring practices for a call center or field service? What areas of network engineering should be addressed to minimize the outages that are causing this increased churn risk? Have we properly accounted for expected customer losses in our financial projections? Is new or different equipment needed to support customers in certain areas that have frequent service problems that are leading to customer loss? These are all areas that can derive value from having the access to the churn model or other analytics, but if we stay in our silos, it will never get there. That said, we need to think about it as not only how do we use this in the area that it was first intended, but who are our constituent stakeholders? And that may be a broader audience than we initially thought. We need to evaluate who else has a need or a stake in using this information. How might it be used? Of course, they'll only use this if they trust it. So how do we scale out with integrity? You need to have a common understanding and a common pool or lake of data to achieve consistency in the definitions and usage across the organization. A data lake storage provides an environment to land all of that information without defining its structure in advance, as we talked about before. But you still need to have governance imposed to ensure that the necessary consistency is there to implement processes. That requires stewardship and governance. It gives you the opportunity to take all of that information, land it in your data lake, and then provide a common definition layer for both business users and for your analysts. Often the big data analytics and reporting teams help to define those structures and the data dictionaries that then get leveraged in other APIs and other environments. The other place where integrity tends to get lost is when you scale out your data science team. So rather than just having more access to the data, you also have multiple interpretations of how to use that data. So the data will only do what people tell it to do, which means that they should all be telling it roughly to do the same types of things. So when you get new data scientists in, and sometimes they're siloed, sometimes they live in different environments within the organization, there tends to be a proliferation of code, of tools, and of business rules that are being applied. And these data scientists and analysts are often kind of in their own corners doing their own thing, yet they really need to collaborate. It's crucial for data-driven organizations. So to do this, you have to have a shared environment with common data sources, script libraries, and definitions that promote that coordination and collaboration across data science teams. With those structures in place, they can reuse not only the data sources, but also the insights and models from one to the next. Some of the ways to do this are to use a source code repository or management system such as Git, can provide a combined environment for storing the models and the data sources that they're using, such as Azure Drive or SharePoint, and even just providing a place where data scientists can chat with each other, like in teams, and distribute insights to other analysts throughout the organization. All right, so let's talk a little bit about scaling out our telco churn model. One of the things that Azure Machine Learning provides that we saw in both webinars 1 and 2 is that there are multiple ways to deploy a machine learning model. One is to write back to the database, as we saw in webinar 2. The other is to do a real-time web service. So just to give you a shot of that, there are multiple ways to deploy those web services as well. In a write back, you're typically using a batch mode, which is a bit slower. And then in web services, you're in a near real-time capability. So let's talk about how that might influence different areas of the organization. So remember, we started in marketing. We created a dashboard for a marketer to use. But there are other areas that this can touch. So in call center, we would potentially utilize both batch and real-time processes. What you see here is sort of a screenshot of what a call center rep might be looking at in talking with a customer. And there are a couple of ways that we can use the data from the churn model in call center. The first is to route high churn propensity calls to a dedicated retention team. So the actual representative that someone is talking to may be different based on whether or not they're likely to churn. During the call, we could actually rescore their churn using those web services based on outcomes. So as the call center representative moves through their workflow and clicks on various outcomes for the customer, it might say that this customer is less or more likely to churn. And then we would feed those updated scores back to the database for use in other applications, such as route management. This would be for a field service technician and how they prioritize whom they need to serve and repair in a given day. Again, we would use both batch and real time. For example, we could prioritize high-value, high-risk customers for service when doing our daily route selections, so that it would show not only in the manager, but also to the field technician themselves, whom to serve when, based on their risk. Once service is complete, you could have a real-time trigger that updates the scores based on the time to resolve, or if there's a continued problem, to update that as well. All of that could then be fed back into finance. So imagine this would be a batch process. Imagine that finance wanted to adjust their accounts receivable based on projections for their churn. We could have a daily batch that rolls up revenue likely to churn in the next 30 days that then gets sent to a financial system where the general ledger is automatically adjusted to reflect those latest estimates. Because it's finance, of course, there's an auditing process. So at the end of the month, the audits would check movement from prior month close to current month close to see how much was adjusted. Those are just a few of the ways that one model could touch other parts of an organization using more and different types of data. I got through this faster than I thought. So the key takeaways here, scaling your customer analytics hub means fundamentally changing the definition of scaling to include not just more, but also varied data at increased speed used in more ways. Integrated solutions like Azure provide more flexibility and future-proofing than point solutions, and they include lower overhead and lower management. Technology is not the only area to address scaling in your customer analytics hubs. You have to consider the processes and the people supporting and using that technology to ensure that they're all in the loop and able to maintain the veracity of your analytics. Governance and trust in the data leads to that reusability across business units. And the activities that are associated with analytics are just a starting point. There is business transformation that spans well beyond the point of origin as we think about all of those constituents, all of those stakeholders for using that data and those analytics, and then coming up with the next analytics for the organization. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to John to wrap us up with content.
Hey guys, so thought I would tie a bow just briefly on what we've talked about today and its relation to everything else that we've talked about. When we first set up the webinar series, one of the points of view we shared is the fact that there are a lot of companies out there at various stages of maturity within analytics, and invariably in our engagements with clients, there's always a bit of hesitation on around ultimately how do we get started? How do we start to begin the journey, get over the inertia of being able to do the things we long know we've needed to do, but in a way that has a bit of a roadmap that's realistic for companies that are in early stages of really understanding what to do with analytics. And I thought I'd go back to this concept at the end just to tie it together. Fundamentally, what we have found works best is a stair-step approach to customer analytics, and this is in large part rooted in the fact that the challenges we see within every organization deal with 4 key areas of people, process, technology, and data. From a people perspective, so many companies are struggling with the fact that they've got 1 or 2 or maybe 3 people that are tasked for all things analytics or business intelligence or data warehousing. The technologies and the hype around the technologies are far outpacing company investment in staffing to do something with the technologies. Yet, despite this, there are so many more lines of business. Lexy alluded to the fact that you've got finance and you've got marketing and you've got supply chain. You've got all of these different constituencies that in some way want more freedom, more autonomy in being able to navigate data, but doing so in a curated or governed way. As I said earlier, there's never been more technology choices out there that companies need to contend with are in and around the area of business intelligence and more holistically in and around the area of customer analytics. And despite the advances in technologies and the appetite for analytics, most companies are finding themselves in this scaling out conundrum that Lexy so well put, where you've got all of these different disparate data sources all over the place and no real unified vision or mechanism around bringing that in-house. So what we often say is what's needed is not to approach the entry point of your analytics journey through purely a tools or technology lens, because that's only part of the piece of the overall puzzle. You've got to first evaluate how different people within the organization will want to consume the information. Is it self-service? Is it outputs of models? Is it embedded within a workflow of some sort of CRM or accounting type of system? You would then need to be able to anticipate the demands from those constituents, from those different stakeholders, by implementing processes for triaging and prioritizing and reconciling the different requests and questions that come in. You need to then use that knowledge of who your end users are, how they want to consume the data, the processes that need to exist to start to prioritize and rationalize the use cases, the reference architecture, and ultimately the investment decisions that need to be made around technology. And then finally, all of that should drive the strategy and the sequencing of how you start to take the data that's scaled out and begin to bring it in and begin to centralize it and govern it in a way that really drives business value within 3 months. All of that is possible if you start in and around the area of customer analytics. Invariably, if you had to pick a single important area through which to focus first on really driving return on investment and consequential impact in your business, you should take a look at what 41% of other organizations are looking at increasing investments in, which is the area of customer analytics. This is a chart that I had shown previously that Gartner does annually, research around expected technology investments in different areas in and around analytics, and customer analytics has been top of the list for several years, and you'll see the gap, 41%. It's by far the leading area that companies are concerned with. So given all of that, you've got the challenges around people, process, and tech. You've got disparate data all over the place, and you've got this clear market research and overall trending around more companies wanting to pursue more customer centricity and personalization efforts and just a better understanding of the customers. How do you get started in customer analytics? That was essentially the topic of webinar 1. It's delve into the analysis. It's a short-term phase, lots of iterations, lots of different work in and around data exploration. This again is enabled through a variety of different tools that exist out there, and it's never been easier in terms of a point of entry than to do some of this type of work, as we showed with Azure Machine Learning at the top of the webinar series. Ultimately, analysis can't exist just for analysis sake, and a lot of organizations fall down on this step. They'll come up with insights, but there's never really an eye towards automating or instrumenting the workflow, the dashboards, the reports, the downstream systems with those insights, and that's where the theme of webinar 2 came in, and the second step of the evolution, which is all around automation. How do you start to create processes to remove the need for so much manual work and analysis, be able to socialize those incomes and make those insights actionable? We walked through an example of how you could consume churn within a dashboard within the Power BI environment. And then finally, how do you scale that out? That was the theme of today's webinar. It's invariably when you're focused on a customer analytics effort, marketing tends to be the loudest, clearest voice that justifiably has many of the initial needs within a roadmap perspective. But what about finance? What about merchandising? What about some of these other departments that may have equally, if not more important use cases in and around that type of data? And so scaling out beyond the departmental view to the enterprise view has got to be a component of the roadmap. And again, the technologies exist today where you don't have to cobble together many different vendors, many different stacks to get there, and you don't have to necessarily be looking at 18, 24, 36 months to be able to realize that. Finally, I should mention that beyond scaling, there's invariably a rinse and repeat. There's a feedback loop. How do you start to take those insights? How do you start to take the outputs of recommendations and actions that are a result of scaling the analytics insights, and ultimately further enrich, further scale out the data that you have about how people are responding, how departments are responding, to essentially create even more momentum around the data assets that you have at your disposal. So that was essentially the series recap. Number 1, we talked about analysis, and we delved into 9 different use cases that ultimately are the lowest hanging fruit in and around driving immediate value or immediate impact within customer analytics, within the areas of customer loyalty, customer experience, and customer journeys. And we specifically went into churn or customer retention, which is a key lever to pull within the customer loyalty realm. We talked about automation and we showed dashboards, automation, and the governance of that model within a larger framework, within a more typical workflow that would exist for line of business. And then finally, we talked about scaling up and scaling out from there. How do you go beyond just marketing and really support other areas of the business? And with that, we have concluded today's webinar as well as the webinar series. But before we go, we wanted to make sure that we open it up for Q&A. So I'll hand it back over to Caroline.
Thanks so much, John. And we did have a couple questions come through during the webinar, so thank you guys for submitting those. We do have a little bit of extra time, so if you have any additional questions, please feel free to submit those to the right at this time using the question on your chat box. The first one, I think Lexy would, honestly, either of you guys can get this. I think Lexy, since you spoke to data lakes, would be more for you. The question came from Ron. What are some of the challenges or barriers for an organization to build and maintain a data lake?
Sure. So most commonly, it's around getting data into a data lake environment. If you're trying to manage this yourself, first of all, I wish you all the luck in the world. But secondly, it's a matter of finding, scalable technology. So building a scalable infrastructure from a hardware perspective, making sure that you have the skill sets internally to not only administer that, but also to then get data into that environment. And then from there, when you think about the data lake and maintaining it, there's often a tremendous barrier on the usage of it. So organizations typically don't have the programming internal requirements to maintain that from a usability standpoint, because it does leverage a lot of the same types of developers as software, or potentially your data scientists doing more programming intensive. So those are some of the bigger barriers that I've seen coming into data lakes. I will say that services like Azure Data Lake Storage do make that a lot simpler, because you have the ability to use the Azure Data Factory to help you build and maintain that data lake without having to have all of the knowledge internally.
Great. Here is another one for you as well. This one is asking more about social media. So how can you build a business case that can be made for pulling in social media data as a business value proposition?
Yeah, so what's interesting about social media is I find that there's usually less a need to provide a business case, because people see the desire to have that in their environment, and more the question of how do we leverage it. And so I think the easiest way to make the value more apparent is to talk about how it's going to be used, which commonly, if you don't have your customers tagged with their social media profiles, is around Net Promoter Score, NPS, sentiment, any mention trends, and so forth, that play into identifying potentially problems that are going on within the organization or even elsewhere. So if you have, for example, if you see an upswing in people saying that their internet is out, or saying that they've had a poor customer service experience, they may say it on social media but not say it directly to you. And so mining that information can provide a great amount of insight into the organization.
Caroline, I can follow up on that as well. My own experience in the social media analytics space calls out a couple of areas that invariably are most interesting to executives. Number one, from an analysis use case perspective, one of the more interesting things to tackle is the fact that not only do organizations, particularly B2C organizations, but also B2B, not only do organizations have this unrivaled fire hose of information that they can more or less mine and start to glean insights for whenever they want, but they have it against a competitive set of companies as well. So in the area of competitive intelligence, so specifically how, if I'm a hotel brand, What is the perception of the cleanliness of my rooms, the customer experience, price, locations, certain discrete elements of what I would call a taxonomy relative to my competitors. That can be a very useful, very impactful, focused use case in and around the area of social media. More generally, from an ROI perspective, that has been a fairly elusive kind of metric to get at as it relates to social, primarily because there are so many limitations around linking social media mentions to a discrete entity or discrete customer that allows you to measure it in a traditional way. Having said that, the other tactic I would talk about is the fact that a social media analytics effort often is what I would call the gateway drug to a substantive conversation around the value of text analytics. Text analytics in general is still really not widely known among and understood among most executives within most organizations. And where social media analytics can be a bit abstract as to how to get to ROI, text analytics focused on customer chat data, focused on call center logs that are transcribed, focused on warranty issues, there is huge ROI in those types of use cases. So often social media analytics is a convenient, shiny object to highlight and start to educate around the value of text analytics in other contexts. And that's invariably, I think that's the bigger win.
Awesome. That's a great point, John. Thank you for adding that. Thank you both for your answers. We're coming right up against time, so I do see some more questions coming in. We're going to answer one more that seems like a clarifying question, and then if you've submitted any and we haven't gotten to them, we will be sure to email a response. The last one for Lexy, I think there was some confusion around what a semi-structured data set is. Can you please clarify that and give an example?
Sure. So semi-structured data is typically data that looks like a text file of some variety, but has some amount of hierarchical information or relationship information embedded within it. So we commonly see this with things like web tracking and tags, or even with something like product attributes, where a given product may have multiple attributes. It's not necessarily set up in a, here's a product in one table and then here's a list of attributes in another. It could have one, it could have many, it could have zero. It's sort of, the structure is unclear. So those are some of those. The other one that's been coming up quite a bit lately is graph style databases. So it is semi-structured in that there are relationships, but they're flexible. So for example, a customer may own a product and yet want that same product. And so you want to be able to reflect both the ownership and the desire so that it has both relationships rather than just this customer purchased this one thing. You want to be able to see that in different ways. And there are a lot of applications for that in different areas of the organization as well. So those all become kind of semi-structured in that there's not a rigid schema associated like you would have with structured data where it must fit into the tables and relationships and cardinality rules that are part of your structured environment, where it will fall out of the database if it doesn't. In this, it's more flexible and gives you a bit more capability to analyze it.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for participating on this webinar. At this time, we are going to go ahead and wrap up. As I mentioned, a copy of the recording and the slides will all be provided to you in an email in the next 24 hours. If you have any additional questions, you can email them anytime to info@ccgbi.com. And you can also watch the other webinar series and find other content on customer analytics powered by cloud on our website, ccgbi.com. Thank you all for participating and have a great rest of your day.